Welcome to LYLAS. You grew up in the 90s and you know what that stands for. Then by default, this podcast is for you.
So we have a larger audience than what we even thought we would in terms of demographics. So welcome to all.
That's right.
You know?
Especially today's topic. I mean, we're going to be talking about school, kids in school, and, some kids are being raised by their grandparents or being raised by someone other than their biological parents. So this topic really could be for anyone, not just, midlife mamas, as we typically say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that with this being it's May and we're approaching like the end of the school year with all of this, and you're a school psychologist. And so this is not my realm of tea at all, um, whatsoever. And so it's going to be really cool to hear your perspective on this. And again, I really hope that this relates to a wider range of people whenever it's talking about like just school issues in general. So,
Yeah, there's so much that we could cover in school issues. And I've been out of practice for about the last 9 months. I resigned in June and took this year off, but I will be starting back in May. I'm going to cover a maternity leave for a colleague of mine in a different setting, in a different school. Um, It'll be kind of a new experience for me as a school psychologist, but back in the schools, back working with the little people. So
mhm.
I'm looking forward to that, just to see if I still actually enjoy that job the way that I used to when I first started practicing, or if it's time for me to move on and find something else. I think
Yeah.
this maternity leave will be the perfect opportunity to sort that out with
Mhm.
myself. But having been out of practice a little bit, I was like, I have to think about what are we going to talk about today. And I think
Mhm.
I told you before we got on to record, I've been on the phone with two separate people, one of my mom's coworkers, and then also one of my mother-in-law's friends, who's very involved with her grandkids' education. And so I've been trying to help them sort of troubleshoot and come up with a plan for the
Mhm.
concerns that they had. And they live in different states. But I was like just touching on some of the stuff that we've been talking about, I think would be helpful for anyone
Mhm.
here at the end of the school year that might have some current concerns about their child and moving forward for the next school year. So we're
Yeah.
going to kind of walk through some of that and my soapbox of retention, because I feel very passionately about retention,
Mhm.
and so I just want to kind of get the word out there. If you anybody that's ever worked with me in the school setting knows that this is sort of my bone, and
Mm.
I can't let it go because the research supports it that um, it doesn't work, and I don't
Mhm.
understand why we still use it or why people think that it is going to ultimately help a child to hold
Mhm.
them back. So I definitely want to delve into that. But at this point in the school year, I think most parents are ready to give up the daily routine, the weekly routine,
Right.
a little bit of freedom and to take those summer trips and to
Mhm.
just spend time with their kids. It certainly presents a set of challenges when you're a parent, a working parent, trying to find childcare for your child in the summer. But ultimately, if you've ever worked in a school, you know that this time of year brings that conversation, the
Yeah.
retention list, as we used to call it. And it just was like nails on a chalkboard for me, because it felt like we were
Yeah.
setting these students up for failure, when we're using interventions. And I'm going to use air quotes because it's not an intervention, but it is a practice that is still widely used in public education for students who are struggling. And there's so many other things that we can do besides retention. And I feel so passionately because the research does tell us, we've got decades of research that tells us that not only is it not effective,
Mhm.
it actually does harm to children. And I think if more parents knew that, they would be a lot more hesitant to agree to having their child retained in kindergarten, first, second. I know, here in the state of South Carolina, um, we have a law currently in place, a third grade retention law. And if they don't earn a certain score on the state testing, then they have to go to like a summer program in order to move forward. Or if they don't do that, then they're retained in third grade. And so some of it, I understand
Yuck.
it be avoidable, but even with that, there's so many ways around it. I just, it should, the amount of children we should be retaining is zero. I think
Mm,
there are
mhm,
maybe some extremely rare cases where it might be appropriate, but I
mhm.
still would argue that there's other avenues to take besides retention to help that child, regardless of what the extenuating circumstances.
Yeah.
So
So what
I
are some factors though that lead to retention in kids? Like what have you personally seen or have you, I don't know, been confronted with that leads to that conversation happening and taking place?
It's typically your lower achieving students. And mind you, I worked in a school that was, like 90% poverty, like deep poverty. And so a lot of the barriers to education were already in place when they came to
Mhm,
kindergarten. A lot of these children maybe had not been read to every night or just didn't have this. A vocabulary that they needed to access curriculum in kindergarten. A lot of students that don't speak English as their first language.
mhm,
They're, huge targets for retention because they're trying to learn not only a second language, they're trying to learn their primary language, a secondary language, and they're trying to learn to read. And we put a lot of pressure on those students to achieve at the same rate as their monolingual peers, their peers that speak English
mhm,
only. We expect them to be achieving at the same rate. Well, it's not going to happen. And so a lot of students that often get referred for retention are typically bilingual students.
mhm.
And then you have some students just that have struggled to learn to read or maybe their math is low, their writing typically if you can't read, your writing is also lower achieving. But then COVID just threw such a monkey wrench into all of those things. We used to be able to sort of narrow down and look at other factors. But then you've got so many kids that miss school. And while that's excused absences now, it still doesn't negate the fact that kids are missing, copious amounts of school. If you're
Yeah.
missing 30 days a year, that's going to impact your academic achievement.
Mhm,
Certainly likely not going to achieve at the same rate as your peers, particularly if you're already struggling, with an area of academics. So they're typically the targets. A lot of times you'll see younger kids. So those children that are born in like July and August, they just meet
mhm,
the cutoff to go to school with their same aged peers. They might be a little bit more immature emotionally. They just haven't developed yet because, again, they could have peers that are 10, 11 months older than they are.
yeah.
And so sometimes those students, particularly boys, will be recommended for retention because of their behavior, let's say,
Mm,
as they struggle more to work independently. And they'll say, well, he's not going to survive in first grade because there's no classroom assistant in that class. And so that teacher's not going to be able to handle him, and so he could do another year in kindergarten. I would get that a lot. Just, I think he would really benefit for another year in blank grade. And I'd say, oh, okay, well, tell me why you feel that way, because there's literally a litany of research that says otherwise. So I would love to hear why you think this is going to be positive for this child and make a difference. And I'm not saying that there aren't cases out there, few and far between, where maybe some observed uh,
mhm,
positive outcomes initially. But research also tells us that those evaporate within 3 years. So while you may observe an initial positive outcome, that those outcomes are going to dissipate within 3 years, and that student's going to continue to struggle
mm,
with their same aged peers. So, or now with the peers that they are matched with that are a year younger than they are. But there's so much to consider emotionally that this for children, that the impact that has on them, their social development, their self-esteem. I primarily worked in an elementary school, which is where a lot of retentions take place, a lot of
mhm,
first, second, third grade retentions. And once they get to, I did dabble some in high school. I worked for 5 years in a middle school, and then I would work over at the high school for special cases, or, if a
mhm,
psychologist was out, I would work those cases. And, one thing that I found, and I think my colleagues would all agree, is that by the time they get to high school, if they've been retained, they will tell you that's a singular event in their life that has almost defined who they are. I mean, that's the first thing they'll tell you. I'm Johnny, I'm in 10th grade, but I'm supposed to be in 11th. I failed
oh my
first
god.
grade.
Mhm.
And so it does have a lot of social and self-esteem impact on students as they grow older. They may not realize it when they're in first grade that first time around. You'll think, oh, Johnny's fine. He didn't even notice. You know,
Mhm.
he's got friends in this grade level too. It's fine. But as he gets older, he knows, he's aware, and it feels like a failure to him that something's wrong with him, that he's not as smart as everyone else. And so just you have to really consider all of the other impact that it has on a child besides just whatever narrow area of academic that you're concerned about. Sure, academics are important. Sure, you want to set your child up for success in the next grade level. However, it's also important to have social emotional development and to have friends and high self-esteem. All of those things are going to impact his academics as well.
Mhm.
And so you have to be really mindful of the decisions that we're making. And I think that's a big one. I know I had so many meetings with parents, and some parents are incredibly trusting
Mhm.
of a school system. You know, they, whatever you tell me to do, whatever you think is best for Johnny, yes, we'll do it. Whatever you
Yeah.
think. If you think that this is right. And I think that parents need to challenge that sometimes. And if
Mhm.
a teacher is saying to you, "Well, I think he would benefit from repeating kindergarten," okay, well, show me why. Show me what you've already tried that didn't work, or what you did try, maybe some things that you tried and it did work. But there should be some really in-depth discussion about why the teacher feels like that's appropriate for that child, and
Mhm.
how ultimately he or she feels like that's going to improve whatever outcome that they're concerned about. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and just hearing you say this, it is kind of shocking to think that this conversation is most of the time taking place at the end of the year.
mhm.
Like, why is this not like a meeting that's occurring, I don't know, after the first like 12 weeks of school, whenever you start to really settle in with a student, instead of like this, well, we're here now and we're not ready, so we're just going to hold off. Like, what's the premise behind this, and where do you as a school psychologist come into play? Is it just at that point, or does the school system consult you throughout a child's academic year if they're struggling? Or they do just manage it and to be like, hey, guess what? We're holding this kid back.
Well, best case scenario, I would have already been involved as my role as a school psychologist. I typically analyze the data in the school. So every time we're doing any sort of benchmark testing in reading or in math, I'm analyzing those results to try to identify the students that might need additional support based off of their performance on these tests. Now, again, this is one assessment. And
Yeah,
so we don't put everybody into some sort of intervention based off of one assessment. However, if you've got a student that has scored low, I'm going to look at those specific groups of kids. I'm going to look at other data like their attendance. I'm going to look at previous records. I'm going to look at their classroom, examples of their classroom work, so that I can see, exactly how they're performing within the classroom. And then we would typically sit down as a team and develop an intervention based off of what we're seeing that student's specific skill deficit is, what they
sure.
specifically need to work on based off of this kind of data collection. That's a process known as multi tiered systems of support, MTSS. It used to be
Mhm.
response to intervention. Um, it's the same thing. They just rebrand it every couple years and put a shiny bow on it, and everybody buys some
Right.
new software that's going to save the day. But if you can think of it like layering on a cake, everybody gets that tier one instruction. Every kid in a
Yeah.
building gets that standard instruction that is put out from the school district that everyone gets, sort of.
Mhm.
And then you have students, typically you have a group of students that aren't going to grasp the concepts just off of that standard instruction. And so they're going to need a little bit more. So you sort of layer on that first layer of icing, if you will. And that's typically where we would come in with some sort of maybe accommodations
Mhm.
um, that student. It might be some additional, like, specific testing by the teacher to sort of drill down and find the actual skill deficit. If we don't have that information already, we might need some other, like, quick measurements so that we can drill down and find the real problem. And then we might layer on an actual targeted intervention based off of
Mhm.
that information. That's ongoing. That can happen all throughout the school year. The parent would be involved to some degree. They would certainly be notified that their child is
Mhm.
receiving some additional support. And so that would be one indication to the parent. Okay, my kid is below, or the school has recognized that they have this specific deficit. This is what they're doing to address that. Great. And then the school is providing the parents with updated progress reports to say, okay, this is what we're doing. It seems to be working, or maybe we've been doing this. It
Sure.
doesn't seem to be effective. We're going to try something else. That's sort of, again, you're just layering on, trying to see, okay, can we solve this with some
Mhm.
interventions that we have accessible in the school? And then if this has been going on throughout the year, the student continues to struggle, that they've had good interventions in place. That again would be, so my role would be more consultation up to this
Mhm.
point, consultation with the teacher, maybe even with the administration or whoever's going to sit on that MTSS team.
No.
It's one of the hardest things about working in schools because we have very
Mhm.
little control over the situation. We know what's best practice, we know how to implement best practice. And
Mhm.
ultimately, at a building, the principal is the ultimate, they decide what happens in their building. And we're just there to help determine eligibility for special education services and
Yeah.
maybe provide some input on interventions if they ask, or to analyze some data. But a lot of school psychs, our roles are to deal with behavior issues
Mhm.
and to do testing for special education. Uh,
Yeah.
and so we could be utilized in such different ways if there are good intervention practices in place. Having those discussions, and then you have a team developing a plan to help that teacher implement the plan.
Yeah. And I
It
think
seems so
too,
simple.
it does, but it's so much of it, I think that as parents, we're often not aware of what can be done, or if our kid is just struggling, or if their performance is normative, or whatever's going on. And to think of an IEP is what we referenced them, I think, here in West Virginia. Um, Both of our kids had IEPs. One, actually, it was a different one for Cameron's was more medical. I don't
Mhm.
remember what that plan is called, but Rachel's in a gifted program, and so it's that too is considered an IEP. It's an individualized education plan because her needs are different than that of the regular kids within the classroom. But I was a kid that was put in a special class. There's my little air quotes. Whenever I was a kid, because, and you've heard me say this, I absolutely cannot stand to read. Why? I'm dyslexic.
Mhm.
Jen has to edit everything I do all
True.
the time. I'm 41.
Worst speller on the planet.
Oh,
I've
so
never
bad.
seen anything like it, and I've worked with a lot of kids with dyslexia.
So bad. I mean, I still got a doctorate, so I mean, I guess it's okay. Like
Right.
I got through.
And you're such a great role model for that because it's not that kids can't be successful. I myself have ADHD. I'm very, I know I had a lot of coping skills as a kid and was
Mhm.
able to maneuver my way through school, but and somehow end up with, 3 degrees.
Right.
But it takes a lot of management, and you
Mhm.
can be successful. And I think we're such great, great role models for that you can have these disabilities and
Sure.
still go on to be successful adults, but we
Mhm.
have to be set up for those. And
Yeah.
solely putting a kid in special education and expecting that to be the answer is not the answer.
Mhm.
We should still expect high achievement from students with disabilities because, in theory, we are putting practices into place to help them access the curriculum so that they can achieve at the same rate as their peers or
Yeah.
closely to their peers. And that's oftentimes not the case. As soon as that label is given, it's like, well, he has dyslexia. He's probably never going to
Mhm.
read on grade level. What can we expect?
Yeah.
They've goals, but I mean, no, we need to be putting practices in place so that those children are also showing adequate
Mhm.
gains over time. Also, a responsibility by law to show adequate gains over time, similar to their non disabled peers.
Mhm.
And so I think if parents know these things going in, they may be less likely to, request, jump straight to like a special education request for evaluation. I have said for years, you could not pay me enough money to be a teacher. You couldn't. The responsibility, the work, they are a special breed of people,
Mhm.
and the good ones, I mean, I would get chills sitting in their classrooms watching them because I know how hard that is. And the really good ones make it look so easy. There are some out there that were made to be teachers,
Mhm.
and they're the ones that make it look so easy. But it is a really hard job, and my heart really goes out to teachers. Um,
Mhm.
I, I often I have a lot of friends, obviously, that are teachers because I've worked with so many of them, and
Mhm.
I often tell them, I'm like, I genuinely don't know how you do it. I don't.
Mm-mm.
Couldn't escape back to my cave after a couple hours of working with one student that was driving me insane. And they have to deal with it all day, every
Yeah.
day. It's just it's impressive, honestly. And I have a lot of respect for teachers, especially
Yeah.
the ones that really give it everything they've got. Getting
Yeah.
back to just kind of like, hey, I'm concerned about my kid. And
Mhm.
the teacher has now brought up this idea of retaining them, but I don't want my kid retained. And maybe I was retained as a child and
Yeah.
saw what a negative impact that had on me. And so um, the first thing I would do is just sit down and have a conference with the teacher and explain that to them. And I'll have the resources on our webpage of, the specifics from the research that shows that it, in fact, does harm and that there is no
Yeah.
research to support retention at any grade level. Um, we'll have that on there as well. And you could take that and in a very non confrontational way say,
Mhm.
I appreciate what you're saying. However, the research doesn't support that. What else can we do for my kid? Come up with a plan with that teacher. And if
Mhm.
you feel like it's not, some personalities just don't mesh, or maybe you had like a, you know, not so great interaction at some point in the school year via text or email, and you just aren't jiving with that teacher, pull in like a third party, pull in a
Mhm.
guidance counselor. School psychologists can sit in. And most of them are very busy. And so I don't want to necessarily put that out there. But most school psychologists like working on the front end of things. We don't like being on the back end where it's special ed or nothing. We're never the most popular person in a building, because
Mhm.
nobody wants to hear that you've put everybody through all these meetings, you've done all this testing, you've written up this 30-page report, and then you come back to the table and say the child doesn't qualify. Those are some of the toughest days. Nobody likes you. You walk out of there, you've worked your butt off, and everybody dislikes you after that meeting. And so, you want to just start with, let's come up with a plan and maybe involve the school psychologist if
Yeah.
there's or someone else that can help us come up with a plan that's knowledgeable about early reading skills or math skills or
Mhm.
whatever the concern is. So that would be the first thing that I would do. You might even pull in an administrator in some cases. It just depends on the school and the teacher and how that relationship or dynamic already is.
Mhm.
Parent. And then if you've got a child, let's say that already has an identified diagnosis, and that could be anything from asthma to allergies to ADHD to
Mhm.
muscular dystrophy. I'm just trying to think, seizure,
Diabetes, yeah, we had it for
diabetes.
diabetes.
Those are
Mhm.
all good candidates for that 504 accommodation plan.
Mhm.
The only requirement really necessary for that is to show that you have a medical diagnosis. So
Mhm.
all you need is really that paper. You present that to the school, and then you say, I would like to request a 504. In some states, they may actually conduct evaluation, like, do the testing. In the state of South Carolina, we often just use the data that we already had available to us. So we would use things like their grades, their curriculum based assessments,
Mhm.
any other assessments that had been completed that school year, any data that basically we could find, we would use that. And then we would say, okay, we've got enough data to support a 504 plan. It's a lot easier to get a 504 plan or to be eligible for one than it is for an individualized education plan. And that's because there's money tied to that IEP.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that federal document that that you're then responsible to implement those specific um, services to that student on a daily or weekly basis.
Mhm.
And so that's
Mhm.
kind of like your last resort. The one thing I will say, and I'll say this, I hope this comes out correctly. There are some kids who have obvious diagnoses. Okay.
Mhm.
Maybe it's like a chromosomal issue,
Mhm.
you know. Um, those students primarily are going to get picked up early on through like a baby net, early intervention. Most of those students are already getting services when they come into kindergarten. And so
Mhm.
I'm talking more about the kids that are just sort of like they haven't picked up on reading yet. So they might know some letters of the alphabet or know some sounds, but they haven't been able to put it all together yet.
Yeah.
So many things can impact that. Their attendance can impact that. The
Mhm.
instruction, education likes to go back and forth on how it's going to present information to children. And sometimes we're using processes that, again, have been proven to not be effective. And so there's so many things that can impact a child's acquisition of skills that we shouldn't always just assume it's a disability present.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, if you're, let's say your child's father has a very strong learning disability, then yes,
Mhm.
they want to consider that earlier on than most people because it runs in the family and we know that it, certainly runs within families. So unfortunately, sometimes, the school psych gets involved too late when there's already a fracture between the parent and
Mm.
the school. And that's
That's
really hard
fair.
to repair. And so it very much always felt like a us versus them situation. And I was always trying to sort of bring us back together. But that's a really hard situation to be in because somebody wants to be right at the end of the
Mhm.
day. And we're
Yeah.
really there to say, well, what's best for this child, to advocate on their behalf.
Mhm.
Sometimes people come in with, they've got their own agenda and there's just, there's something that they want and they're going to do everything they can to get whatever it is they want. But I think most adults, most parents, genuinely want what's best for their kids and they're willing
Right.
to listen to the experts in in education to help them make those decisions, or at least I would hope.
Mhm.
I wasn't always treated that way. Many times treated as though I had no idea what I was talking about, but ultimately the majority of parents are almost over trusting sometimes. I think,
Mhm.
oh, okay, if this is what you think. And it's like, no, you know your kid better than anyone else in this room. You have a say in what happens here. Speak up.
Amen. Amen. And turn to our website for all these tips, resources, and everything that we've got coming up because we've got some good stuff headed your way too, right?
That's right. Check us out on Instagram at the LYLASpodcast.com, Facebook, the LYLAS Podcast, and of course at our website, the LYLASpodcast.com.
Mhm.
I might have just said that twice. Check us out. Lots of resources, tips, anything that you want to know. Send us those questions or comments on our Facebook page or on our webpage, and we will add it to our stacks of notes and
Mhm.
get the info back to you, or we'll do another episode on that specific topic.
I love it. Gosh, I'm so excited about this. Like I said, I just feel like it's going to be so helpful to so many different parents across the spectrum and to know that they have these resources available to them. Huge gift you just gave everybody. Huge
Uh,
gift.
I hope so. I hope it's helpful. I mean, that's the goal, right? We're just trying to be
Yeah,
helpful.
that's it.
So hope that helped somebody. All right,
Amen.
guys. Until next week, Lilas.
Out. We'll see you soon.